Hi guys, welcome back. I'm Ian Laspina, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite genres, fantasy. Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to explore the idea that fantasy armor design specifically, can really benefit from the lessons of historical armor and an understanding of the functionality of historical armor without sacrificing the really cool fantasy aesthetic that goes along with fantasy armor. So it would be a huge understatement to say that our modern understanding of historical arms and armor isn't somewhat influenced by popular fantasy. And in many ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Fantasy, for a lot of people, is what gets people interested in arms and armor in the first place. Without the popularization through fantasy, a lot of people may never have really cared about arms and armor. But if you don't intentionally go seek out information specific to historical arms and armor, the flip side of that coin is because of all that fantasy influence, you're probably going to come into it with a lot of misconceptions about how the real thing functioned. Now, I'm no exception to this rule. I was drawn into historical arms and armor through my love of fantasy. When I was a kid, I lived just outside of the city in New York, and my parents took me to the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was like 5 or 6. And we walked into the arms and armor exhibit there. And when you're this tall and you barely come up to the knee on a horse, and you're looking up at this display of knights in full plate armor on top of armored war horses up on a pedestal, that's a larger than life kind of awe-inspiring experience for a little boy. And I never came back from that experience. I had to have all the toys that were knight related and medieval combat related, all the Legos, the medieval Lego sets, all that stuff. I just loved that stuff. But as a boy of 5 or 6, I didn't understand the history. I didn't know how the armor really worked. I just thought it was really cool. So I filled in the gaps with my imagination, like kids do. And then as I started to get into fantasy, that really heavily influenced my opinions of all those things that I thought I knew about. So then, one of my favorite cartoons when I was a kid was the 1970s version of the Hobbit, the Rankin and Bass version of the Hobbit cartoon. And, I must have watched that hundreds of times. And even recently, I introduced it to my oldest daughter. She's 3. And, it's originally as an excuse for me to watch it again, but she loves it too. So that's awesome. But fantasy has always been a huge part of my life. Tolkien, one of the shelves over here, the entire shelf is dedicated to different versions of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, Silmarillion, different Tolkien works. Both my daughter's names are straight out of Tolkien literature. And then I discovered video games, and my first fantasy RPG was Ultima Exodus, Ultima 3 on the Commodore 64. I still remember the cover art. I still remember the cloth map that it came with, which that stuff is like awesome for a kid, especially in the 80s when that was like, top of the line video game entertainment. I had to run the game off of a 5 1/4 inch floppy to get it to work on the Commodore. Then, I moved on to PC when the PC became more popular. My first PC was a 486, and then when, they got a little bit better, I played games like Legend of Kyrandia, King's Quest, Quest for Glory, Betrayal at Krondor. Then games got like kind of the next generation of games, the BioWare games like Baldur's Gate 2, Planescape, Torment, Icewind Dale, Neverwinter Nights, all those kind of games, right? And then, even today, I build gaming PCs. I'm still a PC gamer, and right now I'm working my way through the Blood and Wine expansion of The Witcher 3, which I think is far and away the best modern RPG, the Witcher series, especially Witcher 3. It wasn't really until I was an adult that I decided to actually explore the study of real historical arms and armor. Up until that point, if I wanted to know something about arms and armor, instead of looking at a book like this to learn about the real thing, most of my opinions probably came more from a book like this. How much armor should weigh, how much swords should weigh, things like what the terminology is: plate mail, scale mail, splint mail, appending mail to everything to turn it into armor. You know, I'm not knocking D&D. I love D&D, but we have to admit too that our fantasy influence has really kind of warped the way that we think about historical arms and armor. And it's not until you decide to kind of go out of your way that you'll really learn about the real thing instead of the fantasy side. All right, so circling back to the original point of how fantasy armor can benefit from historical armor, what we're seeing today is that there's kind of an unprecedented rate of fantasy armor being produced physically, maybe since the Victorian times, but that's another story entirely. But with things like, you know, cosplay, LARP, popularity of fantasy in general, people are making this armor a lot, and there's a lot of resources available to them. Things like the Replica Prop Forum, the RPF. You know, people can go on there, share all kinds of information on how to produce these cosplay armors and things like that. But I really think that there's something missing from the design. What I observe is, you know, in video games and movies, the armors may look really good, and then you have the people who are trying to build it, and they're copying these sources directly. And what ends up happening is, when your idea of how armor should work is based solely on what you're seeing in something that's entirely based in fantasy, you end up with armors that look really fantastic, but when it comes time to make them functional, they kind of fall flat a little bit. So they might look awesome for a photo shoot or, you know, a few minutes on stage for a contest or something like that. But when you try to move in them, you can't. Or, you know, you try to bend your limbs and you can't bend at the waist. And it quickly reveals itself as something that's impractical for what it would really be intended for, and that's fighting in many cases. Now, fantasy is based on suspension of disbelief, right? I mean, after all, it's fantasy, so it's not supposed to be reality. But I think there's a huge difference in expecting your audience to believe in dragons or fantasy races like elves and dwarves and ents and things like that, or the existence of magic. But when you then take an armor design and you ask them to believe that the armor that you clearly couldn't move your elbow in or bend at the waist in is supposed to be a good armor to fight in just because it looks cool, I think you're starting to push the limits of what I can expect an audience to believe as far as, you know, suspension of disbelief goes. It starts to become a little bit immersion breaking, in my opinion. And that's where we can draw on things like the understanding of proper breastplate proportion, weight distribution, how weight should be supported in an armor, how articulation works with respect to human biomechanics. You know, and we have hundreds of years of people who dedicated their lives to figuring out these lessons. Why not draw on that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel? I think we could really benefit from seeing that in design. Let's take a look at some examples of what I'm talking about. So in the video game world, you have, you know, 3 very popular series of role-playing games. You have the Dragon Age series, you have like the Skyrim, Elder Scrolls series, and then you have the Witcher series. In my opinion, The Witcher does the absolute superior job compared to the others of making an immersive, believable world when it comes to the actual objects in the game. When I really enjoyed Dragon Age, well, the first one. I really enjoyed Skyrim, but when you look at things like some of the armors in that game, you can look at them and just immediately tell that no human being would be able to move in them, no matter how fantastically strong they are. They're just not practical armors, although they do look really cool. Whereas in the Witcher series, you have armors that don't sacrifice the fantasy aesthetic. They still look very appropriate for a fantasy world, but at the same time, many of the armors, and not all, and ironically enough, a lot of the poorer armors in that game are the ones that Geralt wears himself. But a lot of the NPCs in that game have fantastic armors that are very much grounded in reality. They may mix designs and visual elements from different styles of armor and stuff, but they bring them together in a very cohesive, fantastic way while still retaining the practical side of things. You see cuirasses that actually fit the body. They end where they're supposed to. The tassets are in the right spot. You know, the pauldrons look like pauldrons. The gauntlets actually look like gauntlets. The helmets are based on real helmets, but adding a fantasy element. Lots of clothes helms, sallets, bar boots, things like that. Even details like wearing plaque belts and stuff like that are shown on the armors that, you know, if you don't even know what a plaque belt is, you may not even realize it's there. But just those little things that made it a lot more grounded in reality. And for me, when I'm playing The Witcher, I feel a lot more immersed in the world because it feels so much more grounded in reality with that whole fantasy element built on top of it, instead of the armors that we see in the other games I mentioned where, you know, I don't know, they just kind of fall flat for me as far as the immersion goes. And of course that's going to be subjective, but it's just something to think about. Now, in the physical world, people are also kind of bringing those two worlds together. And I want to show you two really good examples of that. The first is a Warhammer Fantasy inspired armor, Chaos armor by an armorer in Germany, Bubo Pharaoh. And this is, in my opinion, an awesome blend of fantasy and reality. When you look at it, you know, it's an awesome chaos armor. It looks like a fantasy armor. It looks like it belongs in the Warhammer universe. But at the same time, when you look at the details, again, you start to notice that it's based in reality. You could actually move in this armor. It's real armor. It's not just designed to look cool. You could actually move in it. The cuirass is built in the proper proportion. Look at the shape of the counters, the elbow guards. They're based on real late 15th century to 16th century designs. The pauldrons are straight out of late 15th century Milanese armor design. But on top of these grounded designs, he's taken it and added those fantasy elements while retaining the functionality. And I think that's what makes this kind of an exceptional piece. So the last thing I want to show you is a really cool armor because it's kind of pioneering a new frontier, and that is 3D printed armor. The last armor I showed you was made entirely out of steel. The next armor I'm going to show you is made out of a 3D printed elastoplastic, which, you know, you can of course think of a million applications where you may not want to wear 50 pounds of steel on your body, no matter how cool it looks, at conventions or things like that, or what have you. Now, this armor was made by the very talented Melissa Ng of Loom Cluster, and there's going to be a link in the description to her website down below and her Facebook page, and I really encourage you to check those out. Now, Melissa approached me a couple months ago after having done her first 3D printed armor for Felicia Day of Geek and Sundry, and the armor looks fantastic. It's called the Dreamer Regalia. It's a really awesome looking armor. You should check out the photos for that as well. But after the process was done, Melissa was a little bit disappointed in the way that the armor functioned. It looks great, but like we were talking about before, because Melissa didn't necessarily, you know, have the background in historical armor, it didn't move quite the way that she may have expected it to move. So she approached me a couple months ago about wanting to take those lessons of historical armor and incorporate them into a fantasy design, and we kind of geeked out for a little bit. And then she designed her armor, and along the way, I would just kind of help her tweak little things here and there, and what would work, what wouldn't work in a practical way. And I think the result is absolutely stunning. I think she really knocked it out of the park. And this is the Sovereign armor. This is her newest piece that she just finished. I believe it's in Iceland right now for a photo shoot, and then it's coming back to the US for Geek and Sundry, some stuff with Geek and Sundry. And if you look at it, again, no one is going to look at it and be like, whoa, that's not a fantasy armor. Like, it's, you know, that's awesome. It's an awesome looking fantasy piece. It looks great. But at the same time, again, it obeys those laws of historical armor. The breastplate is in proportion. It fits properly. It cuts in at the waist. When you look at the gauntlets are so mobile because she took the lessons of late late 15th century German Gothic gauntlets and incorporated those into her design. The shoulder articulates properly because she looked at how real armor works and how a German Gothic pauldron is supposed to move on the body. And then on that framework built a fantastic fantasy aesthetic that just takes it to the next level. And I think that's where we could learn a lot. That's where the art form is going. It's one thing to have a fantastic piece of beautiful armor, and it's an entirely next level thing to take that beautiful armor and make it something that works and functions on the human body. People did it for hundreds of years, and there's no reason to ignore those lessons now. And I think it really shows in the fantasy world when people pay attention to those little details. And one thing I'm noticing is that people are really receptive to it, and they may not even realize why they like this armor so much. And I think it's because they're used to seeing so much bulky, impractical armor that when they see something that not only has an awesome fantasy aesthetic, but works in reality, it's just kind of like, whoa, like that's awesome. That's what I want to see more of. So whether you're a 3D artist, a 2D artist, a painter, novelist, an illustrator, you design video games, whatever it is you do, even if your work is purely fantasy-based, I think there's a lot of lessons to be had in the historical arena that can take that design and kind of elevate it to the next level, if you will. Again, this is subjective. You may think I'm completely full of it, and that's fine. But at least consider it, look at some of the historical designs out there, see if they will incorporate into what you're doing, and I think that you're gonna like the result. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave any comments, questions, or whatever you have down below, and I always try to get to as many as I can. Thank you very much to my patrons on Patreon who have continued to support the channel. It's very appreciated, and until next time, thank you guys for watching. Bye.